think we're going to have to pull some shades here. I have some slides here I'd like to show to you, and it might be a little better if it's a little darker. Since the European system said all fires were destructive and therefore bad, it would be incongruent that a natural system would allow itself to be burned, because that didn't make sense in the context of their training. So therefore, all fires must be man-caused. And if you read the early journals and explorations and some of the surveys that were done, fires are usually given to the result of Indian activity, prospectors, hunters, or careless campers. And in the early reports, you see very little evidence of anybody thinking that there might be any other cause, or particularly a natural cause, that would have resulted in a fire, because that didn't mesh with the training at the time. In 1898, a fellow by the name of Frederick Colville, was working for the Department of Agriculture, and he had made a survey of sheep grazing along the Cascades in Oregon and Washington. And in there he made the statement that it has often been claimed that many forest fires are due to lightning. Little credence was at first given to this, and then he goes on to describe while he was on this trip, seeing a lightning strike hit, seeing smoke come up, riding over there and finding a fire, of all things. And he concludes his report, "It is possible that lightning fires may be much more frequent in the Cascades than has been supposed, and the subject is certainly one worthy of further investigation." If we don't accept natural fire as a reoccurring thing, I put you in a different kind of a framework for thinking about things. And so until we get through this concern, why it had a deterrent on development of thinking within the trained professionals at the time. And this thought process went on probably for a few more years before it was finally accepted that lightning was in fact a tool that did start fires. However, by the 1880s, there was enough people starting to show up here in Montana that fires, regardless of their cause, were starting to have an effect on the livelihood of the folks that were living here. And this was probably really demonstrated in the fires of 1889, which probably represented the most large-scale groups of fires that we have recorded, much more so than the 1910 burns and anything since then. We had not good evidence from years previous to that, but there's certainly some indication that this 1889 was not necessarily a out of line year from previous years, but it certainly was one that was much larger because of the people that were standing around and watching them burn, so they knew how many acres had burned. And it became a major interest in the newspapers. Up until that time, you really didn't see much written up in the papers about fires, because they were up in the woods and they really didn't get down where people were concentrated, and so they didn't really get too concerned about them. In the Missoulian of July of 1889, they state that the forest fires which fill the air with smoke are deplorable. They might have been expected in this dry year when the woods are as combustible as tinder. The U.S. government, which owns so much valuable timberlands in Montana and elsewhere, should make provisions for their protection. Many of such fires might be stopped at the start if there was foresters of the right kind on hand. He goes on to state in another news article in the same month, "The city is filled with smoke tonight from a timber fire on Rattlesnake Creek." I understand they just burned up on the Strawberry Ridge. Maybe it's the same place. He says that this has raged for 10 days, and it has destroyed thousands of cords of wood in the stack. besides an area of 10 square miles of standing timber. I found that article interesting because it would imply that somebody might have been cutting some trees up there. And when you start thinking about it, the nearest fuel source for Missoula probably was a rattlesnake, and that probably was a major contributor of wood for home consumption in the settlement at that time. But anyway, they were concerned because it was burning up their fuel supply, and it may have an impact on what they would have for the winter, that they might have to go elsewhere to find their heating source. In the Helena Independent for the same year of August 10th of that year, he states, speaking of the forest fires of the present season, there has been more timber burned in Montana during the month of July than the people have used in 25 years. So these stories reflect some of the first concerns that the publics, the general publics, are expressing about fire and the impact that it's having on them socially and economically. They are starting to realize that somebody's going to have to take care of this problem, and the government should do it because they own most of the ground. The unfortunate thing about it is the reality is that we had maybe a couple thousand people living in this immediate area, and the resources that it would have taken to put out all those fires that they were talking about would have been taxing at best, and probably would not have had any chance at all of being able to do that. The organization within the Department of Interior, which owned most of this land, was such that they were not interested in doing anything like that, because frequently these fellows were appointed for political reasons, and they didn't spend very much time in this area. They spent most of their time in Washington. So there was really no interest on their part to do anything particularly, and the government wasn't really interested in funding anything as far as putting out fires or providing money to do that. So there really wasn't an organization or an agency that was available to do anything about the problem until the Forest Service was formed in 1905. Now Gifford Pinchot was a very dynamic individual, and he really pushed strong for controlled central organization as far as getting the land and the foresters together, and they finally were able to do that. And once he had that accomplished, then the drive was to develop a rationale and a reason for being. Because if you don't have a reason for being in the government and have a reason to go to Congress for money, your agency just doesn't develop very well. So one of the things that was the focus of their attention initially was to develop a force that could put out fires and to sell this to the public, because here's a reason for the organization to become well-financed and develop a structure and the necessary organization that he perceived was needed to run the forest into the future. In his first years as chief, he authorized a study of the history of forest fires so that they could develop documentation showing that fires were bad. He was trained as a European forester also, so his thinking was much the same with everybody else at the time, but he was also very strong in the belief that all decisions should be based on science. So he made a real effort to develop a scientific base for this determination, and he felt as soon as the studies were done, well, he would provide support for them to go to Congress and to show that what we need to do is get out and put all those fires out because it was destroying the forests in the West. Somehow, people did not understand that these things have been going on for thousands of years. There was a breakdown in the logic of this whole thing, and I've never been able to understand what blocked their eyes to looking around and seeing that, in fact, they could see old fire scars, and this thing was a reoccurring event. Anyway, they continued to develop proposals to keep fire out of the woods and to develop a strong fire control system. There was a group of folks that were primarily practitioners, loggers, ranchers, sheepmen, and such, that had been on the ground and had some experience in looking at fire as it was occurring, and they were proposing that maybe all fire wasn't all that bad, but since they didn't have a formal education or background, their ideas were readily dismissed by most, and they really didn't get very far in promoting their ideas. This continued through about 1911 with the studies being conducted, and in 1911 Gifford Pinchot by that time had been dismissed, and Graves was the new chief at that time, and he stated that burning the forest periodically to reduce fuel, and thus a hazard, was utterly out of the question, and it was inconceivable that anyone would seriously advocate such a policy. So they still have a very strong anti-fire bent at this point. Even as information was being developed from their studies, which supported using fire, Graves suppressed the information and would not let the authors publish the findings, because this would pose a real dilemma to in his way of thinking, in how to talk to the public about good fires and bad fires. So he said, we're not going to talk to them at all, they're all bad fires, and he eliminated the study activities and wouldn't allow the publication of any of the findings. This went on to the point where in 1920 the Sunset magazine developed an article on using prescribed fire. There was a group in California who were advocating the use of fire, and they developed a little story about it in the magazine. Well, Graves was very upset about this, and he developed a campaign to counter this through the publications and the news, and to the point where in Seattle, where they were using flyers on the buses promoting this story by Sunset, he put pressure on the mayor of Seattle to get those posters removed from the buses, and they did. So we've had this legacy since the turn of the century, the formation of the agency, to suppress fires. And it wasn't until the 70s, the 1970s, that this finally started to turn around, and there was finally a recognition that we were getting into a problem, and that the continued studies that were picked up after the 60s again supported that fire had a natural role, and that we needed to recognize that if we were going to maintain our systems. Well, with this background then, we were ready to look at what this role actually turned out to be as far as the studies that had been conducted at that time. And if you remember, we're talking about a very dry environment here in the West, which is considerably different than what the European system was based on in their beliefs. One thing we have is a very slow decay rate. Things don't go away. This is a 200-year-old stand that some of the original trees that were in there are still laying on the ground when they died from competition. And this will continue indefinitely because our decay rates are so slow. This ends up in tying up nutrients and constricts the carbon flow, so that your nutrients and carbon are all tied up in biomass, and it's not available for regrowth or for new seedlings or other species to get established. Probably one of the more less understood items was the seed bank renewal that was necessary for numerous species that have evolved with fire and have developed a dependency for fire. And this is not just a tolerance for fire, but they actually have geared their life cycle to the point that if they don't have fire now, the system, they themselves cannot survive in the system for any appreciable time. Fireweed is one of the plants that uses fire as its niche for development. During that period when the trees are gone, you have a flush of nutrients from the fire. It reestablishes very rapidly. It flowers, produces a huge seed bank, lasts for 4 or 5 years, and then it disappears until your next major disturbance. Other plants that are part of the system, like aster, they are present all the time, but their flowering period is very restricted because of the canopy that's over them in most cases. So during periods of following fire, they too take advantage of this and produce huge quantities of seed to replenish their seed banks in the soil. And this usually occurs about 2 years after the burn, and it's referred to as a flowering period following most fires. Even pine grass, which we rarely see with seed head, following the burn, it looks almost like a hayfield here, or a wheat field, with seed heads that it can replenish its seed stock for the future. Other plants such as willow are dependent on regeneration and revitalization through fire. In this case, we can see the willow has been completely removed in the Canyon Fire in 1988, and in 1993, about 5 years later, that willow has surpassed what it was probably about the same height that it was prior to the burn in 5 years. So these shoots are up there probably around 5 or 6 feet on average, and they are lush juvenile growth, very nutritious for animals, and produce a abundant source of food for them. It also provides seed bed for many of our tree species that are common here in the West. Lodgepole pine, as we see here, becomes established right in the ash bed following the burn. And within a few short years, we have a green carpet of new seedlings under the old stand that was on the site. Without this periodic renewal, these stands begin to mature and become over-mature, and you are subject to decay and decline of the site to the point where it eventually will fall apart, and you'll have nothing left but a pile of biomass. With the recycling, you get new juveniles reestablished in a fast-growing system, which provides the food values for other species that are dependent on it. Without fire, we can see wildlife can really impact some of our forage crops. This is some mountain mahogany that has not seen fire on this site for probably 50 years. And they've reached up there as far as they can go, and that plant is pretty well decimated and is just hanging on. Without renewal, the value of forage from this particular site is considerably lower than what it could support, and the number of animals therefore it can support is significantly down. There's a whole group of species that have their niche in life dependent on the results of a fire event. Following a burn, there's a huge array of insect species that come in and live in the dead trees, and this becomes their part of their cycle. And without the fire to produce the dead trees, they don't have a way to maintain their numbers through the system. And here you can see a woodpecker has been working over this Douglas fir, going after the bugs that have invaded this particular tree a year after the fire. And it's primarily the blackback woodpecker, and his strategy in life is to follow major fires. That's where his primary foraging area is. He's not particularly adept at going after mountain pine beetle epidemics, or he's not particularly adept at going into a conventional stand and finding a food source for himself. His whole system is based on chasing fires. How he finds out about them, I don't know, but he will show up in great numbers following a major fire, and the canyon fire in the Seeley Lake area was a prime example of this. They will stay on the burn for probably 3 or 4 years following it, and they eat the insects that come into the snags and bore holes in the trees for their nesting, and their nest success is highly dependent on how successful or how large the fire might be. In other words, if they have a large feeding area in the burn, then they'll have a fairly good number of offspring. If they don't, they just sort of drift along. Part of that cycle is the mountain bluebird, who is dependent on somebody drilling holes in those trees for his cavity to do his nesting in. And his feeding strategy is in the shrubs and the young trees that come in under the stand, and he'll live there until that shrub stage is passed, but they can be there maybe up to 20 years or even more. And without the woodpecker to develop holes for himself, we had to take it upon ourselves to hang bird boxes on fence posts to keep the bluebird in our areas. This whole system is triggered by the fire. And without the fire, the whole thing starts slipping and sliding. And we can pick out a whole number of these kinds of events that are tied directly to the fire. Not just accepting the fire, but are dependent on the fire to maintain their place in the system. Well, as a result of our activities, we've had some major shifts in vegetation structure that can influence those species that may want to utilize or have utilized in the past our vegetation. And probably one of the classics, and I see you have an example of it on the back table there, is the Lick Creek photo points that were established in 1909 in a ponderosa pine system. Here you can see this area was logged with a selection harvest in about 1909. Noticing the piles of shrub or flash that are in the background, there wasn't a great deal of timber removed from this site, so this stand probably didn't change its appearance very much from what it looked like naturally. But it very limited reproduction, quite a bit of grass and understory, and scattered large mature trees. Classic example of the low ponderosa pine type. After fire exclusion, this is about 70 years, you can see we've reestablished a whole different system here. No longer do we have an open feeding area for species that need to view the area for their foraging habits, like a flammulated owl. Here you're dependent on being able to see 10 feet. And if you don't see it there, you're probably going to miss the guy that you're after. So you've changed the whole structure from the standpoint of those species that occupy that area. This is a Douglas fir type mid-slope over near Marysville, just outside of Helena. And you can see that Douglas fir is been burned a number of times, and it's basically a mosaic of burned and unburned stand there on the hillside. And this is somewhat different than the pine system, which basically is visited by underburns. Here we find a series of stand replacement spots and partial burns that are characteristic of this type. This was taken about 1890. In 1995, you can see that the left side of the picture is a very dense stand of Douglas fir. The right side It looks much like it did initially, except that has just been logged. And they haven't burned the piles of brush that are still in there. And the riparian zone below the bridge is now a dense stand of aspen and limber pine and some ponderosa pine. So the structure again has been changed completely, except for the area that was just entered with the logging activity. This probably represents the first classic example of the the rural interface problem. This is the Whetstone homestead in the Sula Basin, taken in about 1895. You can see the hillside behind that house is very open, grassy, with a few scattered saplings and some old mature trees on the hillside. Examination of that picture shows no stumps. In other words, they didn't log it off to build the house. That was apparently its natural look. And you can see that house has wood shingles, log construction, but probably was relatively safe in that environment because any kind of a fire that comes down there isn't going to be a very fast, a very hot fire with that grassy understory. Today we have a different problem. That stand has become a dense stand of ponderosa pine. Any kind of a fire in there now is going to be stand replacement, and that house will not be able to tolerate the heat, and we'll have a stand replacement house. Not only is this occurring in the forest environments, but it's also occurring in our range and grasslands. This is a view taken in Northern California in the lava caves area where the Modoc War was conducted. This was taken during the war in 1873, and it shows a landscape dominated by shrubs and grass as far as you can see. And those hills in the background are grass-covered hills. In 1995, you can see the horizon still has a lot of grassland on it, but we're starting to see a significant increase in the juniper moving onto those sites, which is uncharacteristic and has apparently never been documented in the past. The hills in the background, those buttes, are now timbered stands of juniper. And again, we've had a big shift in our vegetation structure. If we look at some structures here within the Lolo Forest and comparing the 1900 period to the 1984, the red bars of the 1900 period, you can see it's dominated by the old growth stands with a minor amount in the other age classes. You can see we've reduced this and had a major increase in the 30 to 90 age class as a result of our timber activity, and also as a result of some stand replacement fires that have occurred in these stands, which would not have been normal in most cases. It's a particularly important, this is 140 years plus, but the 200-year class up here is probably just about gone in many cases because of the heavy timber harvest that has occurred within that area. The Douglas fir structure is mid-slope sites have a slightly different characteristic. You can see the 1900 was sort of a U-shaped curve with a fairly significant amount of area in non-stock and less than 40 years of age. Probably almost 50% of that area is occupied by the 1900 age class. And if you remember the picture we were looking at with that spotty structure we had on the hillside up there, that would have been typical of this particular area. So you would end up with this sort of a messy look in as far as the distribution of your age classes. You can see today we're all concentrated over here on the right-hand side, and we've lost a significant amount of the open structure, which for some species is a major foraging area for them. A lodgepole pine at our upper elevation, you can see the same old shift. A significant amount of it was in the young age, less than 40 years of age category, and very almost non-existent above 140 years of age. We've now shifted that population to pretty much of a 100-year-old class with some older material up here, and hardly any of the open country that would have been typical of the site at the time of settlement. Well, if we look at that as far as the perspective of what that means to us, in the early landscapes, when they were putting these fires out, this would have been the typical view that they would have had in the low elevation Ponderosa pine, very open. It would have been fairly simple to put a line through that from a firefighting standpoint. Contrary to what we think, the upper slopes in many of our sites were open. This is taken in 1903, 7 years before the 1910 burn on Lookout Pass, which is between here and Wallace. This is where the 1910 burn was supposedly to have devastated the countryside. Well, you can see there really wasn't much to devastate at that point. It had already been hit fairly heavily by fires in the past. So with the firefighters at that time going out and chasing fires in this country, they had a chance at them and putting them out. And you also had a fairly fragmented structure in much of the mid and upper elevation stand conditions, so that you had these helping you to break up those runs that the fire would make and gave you an opportunity to put them out. This allowed fellows that were equipped with fairly primitive equipment to be fairly effective in putting fires out. Today we've converted much of our Ponderosa to young dense stands of immature trees, which have fuel loadings right to the bottom. Our mid and upper slopes are dense, uniform stands of continuous fuels, and we build up huge loads of fuels underneath them. This provides a real challenge to anybody trying to put a fire out. And even with our modern equipment, we're finding that we don't put them out, we wait till the weather to shift, and then the weather will allow us to mop them up. So that brings us to the choices that we have to make. We can continue like we have done in the past and put the fires out. And eventually we will have a fire that takes off, much like the 1988 fire here. With this spot imagery taken from a satellite, you can see Wyoming. Here's the Yellowstone complex. Here's the eastern boundary of Wyoming. The fires over in the Bitterroot Canyon fire. Major impacts on the system. Or we can promote activities that will prevent these events and do a more controlled conversion of that biomass that is continually accumulating. Okay, thank you.
Well, what I really want to talk with you about and present to you fairly briefly is just kind of a bigger picture within which I think this whole change of attitude that Jack has talked about so effectively begins to take on a little bit of a different tone. The fact that we have come to accept the natural role of fire might be thought of as just something that stands all by itself. But in fact, it doesn't stand all by itself. It comes at a period in our history when, in a large number of ways, that we're starting to understand natural systems in a way that we haven't for a long time, And we're starting to give them a kind of respect that we haven't for a long time. I kind of hate to close the blinds here because no, don't open. But we'll get to that. Because the river out there is just such a classic example of that. I'm going to show some pictures here that capture a little bit of the history of how Missoula treated the river. And even though it's perfectly clear that the reason Missoula is here is because the river is here, and because the rivers come together here, nothing could be more undeniable than that. Yet during that same period that Jack talks about this kind of bizarre attitude that we had toward fire, we had an even more bizarre attitude toward the river. I mean, the river was treated as an enemy of the people, right? And we treated it with the greatest contempt that we could possibly come up with. And it's only within the last very few years that we've turned that around. And that is true in a whole series of arenas. And so what I'm here to talk about is not so much specifically the issue of fire, because you're going to get plenty of chance to do that in this series, but to try to put this changing attitude toward fire in a little larger context. So to do that, I'm going to show a few slides. And it's true, there is a kind of historical perspective that we're dealing with here. What I want to suggest is that over the course of the last generation, that increasingly we have come around to appreciating natural forms, natural structures, natural systems in a way that we had kind of forgotten about for a long time. And I wanted to make the argument that that is true on a large number of different scales. So is somebody going to hit those lights? Thanks. So here's the beginning of that story. This is one of those pictures. I think I'll get this mic out of the way. A picture of a kind that simply was not available to us over a generation ago. And while we might have known intellectually that the Earth was a whole system, it was a whole different matter when we began to see pictures like this. When you can see those cloud patterns and realize how delicately interrelated they were, it began to trigger in our minds an understanding of the way in which all of the Earth's systems were in fact interrelated. And that understanding has come home to us now with increasing force, partly because, of course, the way that we have treated those systems has simply become unsustainable. So that now we can no longer ignore the possibility of something like global warming. We can't ignore the thinning of the ozone layer. But it's not only ecologically that the wholeness of the Earth as a system has begun to come home to us. During the same time, we have become aware of the Earth as a global economic system. What is now an inescapable fact of life, whether we like it or not, it is there. The global capital has organized itself as a global system, much in the same way that those clouds organize themselves as a global system. And the same is true in an even more palpable way with communications. We almost all now are part of the worldwide net, and that is something that is not going to be reversed. We are part, in an increasing number of ways, of global systems. But not only global. Here, as we continue on down with this satellite imagery, we begin to see not only those organic cloud patterns, but also the emergence of other organic forms, the oceans and the continents. And strangely enough, during the same time that we have become aware of the Earth as an organic system, we also are becoming increasingly aware of how it is that continents organize themselves organically. This is especially true economically. Once Europe organized itself as an economy, it became inevitable that other continents would follow, and indeed they have followed. And continentalism is something that we and our children will live with now. And what begins to be striking about pictures like this is that the organic forms are there. They are so clearly there. But the inorganic forms, the artificial boundaries that we have drawn on the surface of the earth, do not show up in these pictures, and increasingly don't show up in real life. Now here's a form of map making that combines the old and the new. The picture is still a satellite image, and it shows the western United States in the wonderful way that satellite imagery is capable of doing, capturing the landforms and making us think about exactly what it is that's going on the surface there. But here we've superimposed on that natural picture, or rather have truncated that natural picture by cutting it off in various places. And of course it's perfectly clear that in terms of the landscape, that line doesn't exist, and that these lines down here don't exist. We know, for example, that this system is a whole system. The wolves that have come back into the northern Rockies have primarily come down across that line, not recognizing the line, not caring about the line. The same is true of the Sonoran Desert down here. In the end, it can only be dealt with as a whole system. We're coming closer now to our part of the country. Just to keep you oriented, this is the Great Salt Lake. And now switching to a little bit different kind of satellite imagery. Here, you remember Jack showed you this particular line when he showed you the fire picture. He showed us this boundary of Wyoming. Now look at this picture. Isn't it interesting? The difference between the natural forms that exist there, which are so powerful, and then these straight lines, which clearly can't have anything to do with the landscape. The bison have had the damnedest time understanding what that line is all about. But increasingly, so do the rest of us. The people in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, all of the communities that surround that ecosystem have begun to organize themselves into an ecosystem, which increasingly does not and will not pay attention to those artificial boundaries that we have drawn there. And especially in the West, this is true for all the reasons that Jack talked about, especially the reason of aridity. It has been said over and over by all the wisest observers of the West that if you're going to inhabit this landscape, this arid landscape, that you have to do it according to the way the water flows. You have to do it according to what the landscape says. John Wesley Powell, the founder of the U.S. Geological Survey, said it most clearly. He said over and over again, if you're going to inhabit the West well, you must not draw straight lines on the landscape. Well, you can see about how well we follow that advice. Now we begin to come in closer to Missoula here, and begin to become aware of how it is that the lay of the land determines the patterns of human habitation. You all recognize this landscape. You see the Bitterroot Valley. You see the Clark Fork. You understand that this passage through the mountains was the place that Lewis and Clark were looking for, a place that the waters gather and that people finally were going to gather as well. Now here's a little bit different kind of map making, a kind that John Wesley Powell would have been most interested in. This is the Clark Fork Basin with Butte up here at Anaconda, Missoula here again at the confluence of the Bitterroot, the Clark Fork, and the Blackfoot rivers. Here, for some strange reason, the mapmaker has still not been able to to resist the temptation to act as if the North Fork knows anything about the 49th parallel, and so hasn't shaded in what's clearly part of the North Fork's drainage there. But by and large, this is quite a wonderful picture because it shows a natural area. And not just natural in terms of the lay of the land. Here's some mapping we've done at the Center for the Rocky Mountain West. We began to be interested in the organic regions that surround the cities in Montana. Look at Billings here. This is Billings. This is that Wyoming border again. This is the distribution area of the Billings Gazette. Clearly it doesn't pay any more attention than the bison do to the state line. But it does pay attention to the lay of the land. Essentially, the Billings Gazette confines itself to the Yellowstone Valley, except down here where the divide is so low between the Yellowstone and the Missouri, it reaches over into there. This is a very telling picture. Look at the distribution area of the Missoulian here. Okay? And then look at the Clark Fork. And you see how it is that human patterns, in fact, want to conform themselves to the lay of the land, are not, in fact, interested in the artificial boundaries that we consistently draw on the landscape. Here are hospital care service areas, which shows almost exactly the same thing, and you can do this over and over again with any number of activities until finally you began to get a picture of how it is that human activities actually want to conform themselves to the landscape. Now we begin to come in closer here to our own ecosystem, and this, I think, starts to get us a little bit closer to the topic at hand. What we have here is still satellite imagery, mostly of that Clark Fork drainage, with the Flathead Lake up here. And now we begin to see, as part of that ecosystem, the human habitation that is Missoula, there at the confluence of the rivers. And here, still with the satellite imagery, we see it even more clearly, how that pattern of human habitation is determined by the lay of the land. But we also begin to understand how it is that even though the kind of natural tendency is for human habitation to conform itself in that way, that it actually takes some planning and some care to be a city and to do it in a way that is compatible with the ecosystem. Because what we begin to see here is that the possibility for continued sprawl onto the mountainsides and into the forested areas. And we also see here the possibility of instead of that, encouraging infill development in those areas that obviously are intended for human habitation. These are the kinds of choices that we have to face, and that I think a series like this calls our attention to. We can continue to sprawl as we have sprawled down the Bitterroot Valley here, but we can also begin to contain ourselves and to live in much closer harmony with the ecosystem, so that we don't invite the kinds of problems that in fact bring us here tonight. Finally, away from the satellite photography and down to aerial photography, we see even more clearly the kinds of challenges that we face here, the challenge of infill development, the challenge that Missoula has tried to face by passing open space bonds to protect some of these hillsides. And here we see quite clearly the area that fire suppression really has to deal with in the Missoula Valley. You don't see in this picture the city limits, okay? Unless you're very smart, you don't know where the city limits are. But you know where a fire service delivery area is. And in fact, you can begin to pick out various areas. You can begin to understand how the East Valley here is a natural area that requires its own fire protection in conjunction with this metropolitan area. I'm now finally down on the ground, just looking down into the Missoula Valley with those clouds that might have been the clouds we saw earlier in the satellite photos. Most people wouldn't even know there's a city down there. They would be most aware of the surrounding ecosystem, but in fact, of course, there is a city, and a big part of the reason there's a city is because people love the ecosystem so well. And yet, as I indicated earlier, here at the heart of the city, this picture taken probably from right here, or probably from the second floor of this building, across the river, reminding us of how for all those years, for almost a century, Missoula ignored the river, turned its back on the river, trashed the river in every way that we possibly could. And yet during the same time that we have begun to become aware of natural systems from the global down to the continental to the bioregional, places like Missoula have begun to return to their rivers and understand where they are once again. And this return, this understanding of how it might be possible to be a city and yet to be in touch with nature, I think is a big part of what it's going to take to convince people that it might be better to live in the city than to continue to live out where it is so very difficult for so many humans to live out in the woods. We can actually live very well together here in the city, and we're beginning to learn that through the development of riverfront parks. I'm going to have to get some new slides now of Karas Park. And you're all familiar with this whole story, so I won't tell that, although I enjoy telling it other places. I always end with this picture from Heron Blues by Monty Dolak, who has captured the great blue flying over Missoula late at night, what might be a dream, but it seems to me that it's the kind of recollection of our connection to the natural world that Monty has really captured here.